All right, do we have Elko on the line?
Elko, can you hear us okay?
Yep, now I can. Did you have anyone show up?
We have had no members of the public show up at all today.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we're going to reconvene the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners meeting in Las Vegas with teleconference feeds to Elko and Reno. It is January 29th, and we're opening agenda item number 9. Just a housekeeping item. If the commissioners and the audience could please speak into the mics so everyone in this room can hear, as well as the folks on the phone. We have a tendency to look at each other, and if we do that, just make sure we're talking into the mics. So we'll open with Commission General Regulation 459, Unmanned Aerial Vehicles, Drones, LCB file number R145-15. Chief Game Warden Tyler Turnipseed. This is a workshop, but public comment will be allowed. The Commission will hold a workshop to consider a regulation relating to amending chapters 501 and 503 of the Nevada Administrative Code. It revises provisions governing the use of aircraft, hot air balloons, unmanned aerial vehicles, satellites, or certain other devices to locate or observe for the purpose of hunting a big game mammal and providing other matters relating thereto. Just some background on this. We have had some previous conversations. If you'll recall, law enforcement, as well as our legal staff, believes that the current regulation does include drones, but it's not explicit. So I think it's a good thing to discuss, both from a legal standpoint, but also from a regulatory clarity standpoint, explicitly stating drones within the regulation. The regulation actually has two parts. So one is explicitly adding the term drone and also providing a definition. And the second part would be taking the timeline for scouting from basically any aerial device from 48 hours before the open of any season to a year-round prohibition. And so again, there's two parts to this regulation. Just for clarity on the cabs, next time we bring it back, if we do so in a workshop or for approval format. So two pieces. Both of them have been discussed in the past, and so we're going to run it through the process and see what comes out the other end. With that, Mr. Turnipseed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Tyler Turnipseed, Chief Game Warden. And the chairman is correct. This regulation has two parts. Number one is the explicit adding of the explicit language calling out drones specifically. We've talked about this a couple times over the last few years. I know Director Wasley has asked, Commissioner Drew has asked, and several people have asked, do you think that drones are covered under our current regulation? I know at the legislative session we had some legislators that asked the same thing, if drones were covered under our regulation. Sounds like, you know, the overwhelming agreement that it did cover drones with this language here. It says, except as otherwise provided in this section, a person shall not, for the purpose of hunting, locate or observe, or assist a person in locating or observing any big game mammal. And it talks about management units 48 hours prior. But in subsection A, it lists an aircraft, including, without limitation, any device that is used for navigation of or flight in the air. There was consensus that drones were covered under that, but there was also a consensus that we wanted to specifically add the term unmanned aerial vehicle or drone so that there was no question. We would get calls, you know, from time to time of people saying, hey, I read your regulation, but I don't know if drones are covered. So we specifically, in this amendment, added in subsection C to say an unmanned aerial vehicle. It goes on to define what an unmanned aerial vehicle is towards the end of it. Section 5 gives a definition of unmanned aerial vehicle. And then, if you'll see, the first 14 pages of the regulation are simply our license demerit schedule. That had to be included in there because on the third page of that, you can see the words unmanned aerial vehicle added into the demerit schedule. That's the only reason for the first 14 pages of the regulation, is just to add that word into the demerits. So that's the first part of the regulation. The second part is taking out the part that puts it from 48 hours prior to a hunting season in that unit to the close of the big game season in that unit. And this regulation amendment was asked for by some of the board members and would expand that to make it a year-round prohibition instead of just during the hunting season, or from 48 hours prior to big game season to the close of. By doing that, it strikes out the language during the period beginning 48 hours before big game hunting season opens until the close of the season in that management unit. And it also makes the portion unnecessary about describing how, for the purposes of this regulation, mountain lion season is not considered a big game season. I know that's a little bit of a complicated explanation, but I'd be available for questions.
Questions or discussion by the board? Commissioner Valentine?
Chief Turnipseed, when I read through this, I guess if I get on Amazon and I go and I buy me a drone and I decide to take it out, let's say in the Spring Mountains, somewhere south of town, and I fly it, am I in opposition to this?
No.
Am I guilty of an offense here?
It depends on what you're doing with it, Commissioner Valentine. To answer your question, there's a key phrase in this first section that's very important to the meaning of it. It says, "A person shall not, for the purpose of hunting." Those few little words right there are critical. So, the drone industry obviously is taking off, pun intended. The governor's office is really promoting Nevada as the drone state. All that stuff, good to go. This body, of course, only has the authority to regulate hunting, fishing, trapping, and boating, and those key words right there, for the purpose of hunting. In other words, if you're flying your drone for scenic photography, real estate, all the different contracted activities that drone companies are doing, mapping, habitat evaluation, law enforcement, military, all that stuff, none of that is covered unless it's locating or observing big game animals for the purpose of hunting. Obviously, that's a fairly difficult burden of proof on us. To be able to see a drone in the air, you see it going up a canyon in the mountains is one thing. Even if you see it go over a herd of elk, that's still just one thing over here. We're still a long ways from meeting that burden of proof of whether they were locating or observing animals for the purpose of hunting. That answer your question?
Additional questions or discussion? Commissioner Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as whether it's unlawful or not, is private land considered the same as public land?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Morai. Chief Game Warden Turnipseed again. This regulation makes no differentiation between public or private. It would still be that burden of proof of locating or observing big game for the purposes of hunting. I suppose it would be just the same on your private land as it would be on your public.
Okay, so in other words, it is becoming more common for landowners to be doing inventories of wildlife on their private land. And so they may be viewed in here where it's flying slowly at low altitudes, hovering, circling, repeatedly flying. This language, if I can understand that 48 hours before the hunting season or during a hunting season, but year round, do you see any problems, or do you see, is there enough protection for landowners with this language so that they're not going to get a citation for performing those duties?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Morai. Tyler Turnipseed again. In my opinion, yes, I'm certainly not a lawyer. I think it comes back to that burden of proof of for the purpose of hunting. If you're doing an inventory for some sort of habitat issue or grazing issue or mapping, any of that sort of stuff, I think you'd be still okay because you're not in that for the purpose of hunting area.
Commissioner Young?
I just add, Pete, and there's an old adage in law enforcement that intent is 9/10 of the law. And a law enforcement officer, Tyler, jump in and correct me wherever I'm wrong. But I think I went to the academy, Tyler, before you were.
Please speak in the mic, Commissioner.
Anyway, the intent has to be shown by the person trying to commit the crime. So it's just not the law enforcement officer observing it. He has to show before he makes an arrest or writes a citation that you were intentionally trying to violate the law to commit a crime. So that would entail, along with just flying, hunting. That's the way this thing's written, in the way that he has it in here. And unless somebody was on the ground that they could show that you were directing them in communication with, or the person flying the drone was actually there with a rifle or a bow or for what other type of weapon to hunt, he couldn't write the citation just merely based on you flying circles or, flying around out there. The intent of the person is the most important part of making an arrest or writing a citation. It's just not what a law enforcement officer observes. A lot of things, I've seen, I made dozens of arrests that were thrown out of court in my day because I observed something that the judge didn't feel, that I proved the intent. That I didn't know what was going on in the mind of that individual. Now, it may have looked bad. This girl was walking up in Las Vegas Boulevard with a short skirt when I was running the bicycle out all those years. Doesn't mean that she was out there for purposes of prostitution. You'd have to prove that, that person was. So those cases are very, very difficult sometimes in misdemeanor crimes to show, the intent, and you gotta have that in, or the case won't fly. No pun intended.
Additional comments or questions? All right, seeing none, we'll open it up for County Advisory Board input here in Las Vegas.
John Hyatt representing the Clark County CAB. Unanimous vote 7-0. The Clark County CAB opposes the regulation as written. Although the board feels a regulation is needed, the one as drafted is not it. The regulation is poorly written, potential regulation is poorly written, has many potential unintended consequences. Many parts appear unenforceable. This is a complex federal and state issue that is dramatically evolving in real time. This commission regulation needs to make sure it gets it right. Thank you.
Mr. Hyatt, while you're there, I read that in your action report. Was there any discussion during the meeting on ways to clarify or certain aspects that were unclear?
I think our concern is that this is such a rapidly evolving issue that most of us don't even know all the ramifications of what's going on and maybe don't fully understand the technology that's out there. For example, there's like 295,000 drones that have been registered with the federal government in the first 30 days after regulation, after you're supposed to register them. With all of the camera equipment that's on them or can be on them and everything that's happening, how do you know what the intent of the person is, and how do you actually show what's going on? An adult takes his 10-year-old kid with him and said, hey, we're out photographing this thing and looking for animals. It's really great. He doesn't have a hunting license. He's not hunting. We're not hunting here. How do you deal with this? I don't know how you deal with that. It's a can of worms. That's, I think, really the feeling of the CAB. It's just a can of worms. Wish we didn't have to deal with this issue, but it's here.
Thank you. Next, County Advisory Board.
Sean Shea, Washoe County. We had 4 people. We split on this, so we didn't have no motion. I think everybody was in favor of the drone, getting rid of the drones stuff, but the 48-hour thing it almost felt like everybody was thinking it was just getting slid in when you guys set that to start with, and I think everybody didn't like that 48-hour thing, and that's why we were split. One of the other things we were, actually I believe Corey brought it up, about there's a section that says big game animals, and we are thinking it should say basically just all animals, because I see guys, I had one crash in my yard, and the guy was harassing my dogs, and it was, once the dogs got hold of it, it was not a problem. But but I think that you need to clarify that other than just big game animals. So even your cattle, you could harass cattle too with them. So.
Glenn Bunch, Monroe County. This is kind of a repeat. I brought this to you people a year ago, so I'll bring it up one more time. I had a guide was telling me a story. They were on a hunt down here in Clark County last year, a sheep hunt. The entire hunt was filmed with a drone, from the camping to the travel in on the road to where they camped. The hunt, the shot, the recovery, and the packing it back to camp was all done with the drone. And I told the guide, you guys broke the law, you can't do that. He said it's not covered. So I come to you people and said, I think we need to get the word to the guides that if you're gonna, and so that I was surprised, I was glad to see this come back out. I mean, it was used and the guide told me about it and I told him it was wrong. So that right there, I don't know what to say, guys.
For the record, Corey Lytle, Lincoln Cab, we supported the proposed reg, with the exception of adding any game mammal as opposed to big game mammals. Just a couple comments on this. I think we're ahead of the curve on this, or at least staying with the curve, and I appreciate law enforcement, addressing this. Things like Mr. Bunch, trying to let people know that this is what's going on. The intent of the law is discussed. We would hope law enforcement's going to have that. They're going to have that information. They're going to know if people are out there with a hunting license, things that happen. That in our neck of the woods, this is happening every day, 365 days a year. Guys are using drones to hunt shed antlers. They're harassing game on the winter ranges. So many things happen that maybe in one location of the state is not perceived as being a problem, but yet in a lot of the other places of the state, they're a huge problem. And so we support this, and we would hope that it would get policed, accordingly, and hopefully those sportsmen that are involved in this kind of stuff kind of police themselves.
Okay, additional county advisory board input. Public comment in Las Vegas. Seeing none, public comment in Reno on item number 9.
Oh, don't push the button.
All right, thank you. Yes, hello. I'm just looking at what some other states are doing. It looks like Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Wisconsin.
Could you please, before you start, could you please state your name for the record?
Name's Alan Salini, I'm sorry. It looks like Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Vermont, Wyoming are all dealing with this issue and headed toward bans or have banned the use of drones in hunting. I think for purposes of enforcement and making it a little easier for our enforcement folks, it would be useful to have a universal ban on the use of drones as some of these other states have, rather than just saying for big game mammals, because it's going to be pretty tough, to determine. You don't want someone who has a hunting license to be able to, or not. To be able to say that they're not looking at big game, but if they're in a good hunting area, it would be pretty easy to get off of any kind of allegation that they're violating the regulation. So I think it should be more general, and it should say big game, not just big game mammals, but hunting animals in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Next comment, Reno.
Mr. Chairman, Don Muldy, Reno. I'm not really up to speed on this. I wonder if Chief Turnipseed could explain the mountain lion exclusion. I'm not sure what the thinking is. It may have something to do with the fact that it's a year-round season, but I'd like to hear an explanation. Thank you.
Okay, let's take our next public comment, Reno, and then we can come back on the question.
That's it for Reno. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments in Elko? Okay, hearing none. Commissioner Turnip, I'm sorry, I want to give you my seat apparently, but Chief Turnipseed, could you explain, I think you touched on it, but the reason for the mountain lion language coming out of section 2, sub 2, and why it was originally in there to begin with?
You bet, Chairman Drew. Tyler Turnipseed for the record. Subsection 2 talks about, it reads, for the purposes of subsection 1, Subsection 1 talks about 48 hours prior to a big game season opening in a unit. Said for the purposes of subsection 1, the season for hunting a mountain lion, which is open in a management unit, shall be deemed not to be a big game hunting season. In other words, it's not an exemption from scouting for mountain lions with an aircraft. What that did was, if it weren't for subsection 2, flying year-round would have already been prohibited, because mountain lion season is year-round, and so the way it read, from 48 hours prior to the opening of a big game season in that unit would have meant that a big game season was open in all units at all times because of the lion season. So what that is, it was taking the lion season out of that 48-hour rule. It wasn't saying that lions are exempted from aerial scouting, just that the lion season was not considered a season for the 48-hour rule.
Okay. And Tyler, just to clarify, I understand Clark County's concern about, the ball of wax and the can of worms and whatever else, but essentially, as it stands now, this regulation, in your opinion, already prohibits drones. In essence, we're clarifying. Am I correct in saying that?
I believe that's correct, Chairman Drew. Drones, I believe, were already covered for the purposes of locating or observing big game animal for the purpose of hunting. Drones were already covered under an aircraft, including without limitation any device that is used for navigation of or flight in the air. Adding the term unmanned aerial vehicle is simply clarifying that, strengthening that language so that there's no confusion if somebody looks it up and says, well, is this considered an aircraft or not? Like you mentioned earlier, our Attorney General's counsel basically agreed with us that the drones were covered under any aircraft that flies in the air. This is simply clarifying, strengthening that language to clear it up. You mentioned your authority. Certainly this entity has no authority to regulate other drone industries, only hunting, fishing, trapping, and boating, and that's what it does.
And then one other question, do you know of any cases where you guys have successfully issued a citation under this?
No, Chairman Drew. To my knowledge, we've not prosecuted anyone for this. We've started in the last couple years to hear anecdotal reports of people seeing drones while they're hunting or using drones when they're hunting. I know we've had 2 or 3 reports from the Jarbidge, especially the west side, on some elk hunts. We get reports of people using them during shed season. As Mr. Lytle said, Lincoln County seems to be a hotbed for it, especially during antler season. So we're getting anecdotal reports. We've not made any cases where we prosecuted anyone for a drone use.
How about for just regular general aircraft?
Yes, Chairman Drew, we have made some aerial cases with traditional aircraft. In fact, there's one in my division activity report that Director Wasley will read today, in which a couple Southern Nevada people were scouting for a sheep hunt in northern Washoe this year. Happened to be opening day of antelope season, and there were several witnesses, and we were able to put that case together. Some of their confusion from those folks that were flying, so that they were confused by the 48-hour rule. They thought it was only 48 hours prior to the opening of their season, when in reality it's 48 hours prior to the opening of any big game season in that unit. So this plane flying down over a lake bed, buzzing a herd of antelope on opening day of antelope season was reported by numerous witnesses, and we were able to make that case. I don't know how many we've made over the years. I had one when I was in the field in Lake Valley, right down off of Mount Grafton, in about '04, guy flying a powered parachute. And I don't know if you guys remember, this regulation initially was written and passed in 2002, sort of as a result of the craze of powered parachutes. That was sort of the vogue thing in those days, coming out of Utah and Arizona, with some of the high-dollar guides and outfitters flying around in a powered parachute, which is basically a parachute with a go-kart strapped to it and a big fan on the back. And they were able to fly around at real slow speeds, low elevation, land wherever they want, take off wherever they want. That's sort of the nexus behind how this regulation was born.
I guess that gets to one point that I'd like to make, in that the 48-hour prohibition to me has always been a little muddy, especially when you start talking about prolonged heritage or silver state tag or different seasons, because I'm not so sure a lot of the people who would be doing this would look at a season other than their own. So to me, in a way, this makes it a much more clear regulation as well. One of the suggestions that was talked about from one of the cabs, and I think another one had it in the report, actually 2 of the cabs today, was basically going away from big game mammal and making it any game species. Do you see a concern with that? I would see a concern with it if we leave the 48 hours in, because obviously we have seasons stretched across all times of the year, whether it's birds or turkeys or whatever else. But do you see any issues with changing big game mammal to any game?
No, Chairman Drew, I don't see an issue with that. I think it could be done. Might have to sit down and scratch my bald spot a little more to think on it in depth, but my knee-jerk reaction is that I think we could do that.
By the time we're done with this, you're going to have a bigger bald spot. I think.
That's correct. It's growing every day.
So one last question, then I'll quit grilling you. On Section 2, Sub 1B, it talks about a satellite or any other device that orbits the Earth and is equipped to produce images. I guess a case could be made for products like Google Earth. Is there any sense in, while we have this regulation, clarifying that would be real-time images?
It's another good point, Chairman Drew, that we haven't necessarily considered in the past. I know someone pointed out to me that the fact that on Google Earth there is a little band of sheep that was visible on a mountaintop in Nevada for a while. Those are updated periodically, and I'm not super familiar with it. I don't know how often those are updated. I think it has to do with what's in the view. I think around the urban areas they're updated more often, and the rural areas less often. So yeah, I think if you look on some of the satellite imagery, usually those images are old enough to where they're not applicable to a hunt. But it's one of those things like we were talking about before. 5 years from now, I don't know, will we be seeing fresher images that are within a week or within a day? I don't know, that is a possibility for down the road. I'm sure right now there are people in the military or whatever that can tell you where every sheep is on Mount Jefferson with their satellite. Not available to us in this room, but I suppose that potential is out there in the future.
Yeah, and I guess just to make a point, some of these changes that we're discussing, obviously we'd have to check with LCP to see if it was a big enough change, if we had to run it back through them. If it was, potentially we're looking at a second workshop. But I think while we have it open, the more we can clarify some of these points, the better we're going to be. So at this point, the two additions that I would support in addition to what's already there is making the universal change from big game mammal to any game and making sure we don't have some unintended ramification, let you grow your bald spot a little more on that. And then maybe looking at real-time images under the sub D for the satellite imagery. That's kind of where I am. Additional commission comment? Commissioner Young?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing you could do, Tyler, eliminating a separate section is just incorporate in 2A any aircraft. You could change the wording to any aircraft, including unmanned area vehicles or drones, so you wouldn't actually be adding another subsection. Just throw it in there. My opinion is spot on. I'm having a hard time understanding Clark County, where I'm from. 7-0, saying that this is ridiculous. I'm just not getting it, because this is pretty crystal clear to me. I have 2 drones. I bought 2. I got one for a gift. I've been a licensed pilot for 30 some odd years. I flew the police helicopter here for a number of years here in this valley, and I understand the complications here in this valley, because when you're in controlled airspace, and that's where the federal government's had so much in the FAA, so much problem with these drones, it's based on altitude and location. And 500 feet above the ground, it's uncontrolled airspace. The Spring Mountains are uncontrolled airspace. So we could skirt around, never talk to the tower here. Where the drones have been problematic is that they're getting so good and so sophisticated that they're flying at very, very high altitudes, and they're flying out of line of sight, and they're flying in Class D or controlled airspace where, jet planes and other aircraft are flying. And so they had to create a system where they actually license these things and put them under control. In the rural areas where you're in 99.9% of the time in uncontrolled airspace, there's no tower, there's no radar that can catch any of these things. And you think about sitting on a mountaintop up in Jarbidge somewhere, it's pretty easy for somebody to pull up in a truck and take a drone like I own that takes excellent pictures, will fly, probably a mile away from me, I could see it, and hunt to my heart's content, and nobody in the world from the FAA or any control tower could see that or notice that. The only person in the world that might stop me and ask me would be a game warden or another law enforcement officer and say, what are you doing up here with a rifle in your hand, flying this aircraft over the Jarbidge Wilderness area? in town, I get it. So I don't understand where the Clark County folks are coming from. This is very simple. I think you're spot on with this regulation, Tyler, and I would recommend approval along with what Chairman Drew added. I'm totally in support of what he said as well. But I think this nails it. I don't think it has to be any more complicated than this, and I think it'll solve the issue. I think you already had it in A, but again, we're just over clarifying it as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Great. So just for clarification, Commissioner Young, your thought might be to put subsection C, an unmanned aerial vehicle. Just add that on to the end of A.
You could change the wording to start like something like any aircraft, including unmanned area vehicles, drones. You could add anything you wanted in there. Just leave it all in that same sentence, and you'd cover it all. That way, you wouldn't add another line item. And that may, I know Jeremy's concerned somewhat about LCD having to review it again, and make it pretty simplistic.
Great. Thank you, sir. And if I may, Chairman Drew, in listening to Commissioner Young speak, some of the background on drones, or not background, but the more current technology. I was all educated on this by one of my coworkers in Winnemucca who was a drone fanatic. One of the things that they're using now, in addition to having a GoPro camera or something on the drone, is something called first-person view, FPV they call it. It essentially goes back to that those goggles that we were looking at on the Smart Rifle video, to where your goggles are connected to the GoPro camera on the drone real time, so you can fly your drone out of sight into the next canyon, however long your radio control will reach, and be seeing in your goggles what the drone is seeing real time. That, I think, steps it up a couple notches in the hunting application, rather than downloading pictures when it gets back to you.
Additional questions or comments? Commissioner Hubbs?
Yes, this is Commissioner Hubbs. I just wanted to say, I think I agree with Commissioner Young. I don't know.
Mic, please. Speak in your mic, please.
I think that the preponderance of evidence, or the burden of proof, is so much more burdensome for the state that I don't see any problem with the regulation, even as written now.
Okay. Additional questions? Commissioner Johnston?
My only comment is, given that when I read this, and I think we've gone back to this before, this is just a clarification, so it's absolutely clear that the definition of aircraft includes an unmanned, as it's defined here, aerial vehicle. So I don't think we're creating any more prohibitions or any more difficulties for law enforcement. We're just making sure the public is aware as to what the law is, what they can't do, and you rely on people complying with the laws as they're written for enforcement, not just the ability of catching and convicting people for violating the law. And I think once people understand they cannot use, and it's absolutely clear that unmanned aerial vehicles cannot be used, the vast majority of people, they won't be, and will achieve the desired result. So I'm in support of the regulation.
Commissioner Bliss?
Yeah, I hate to keep repeating everybody, but I do agree with the comments that have been made by Commissioner Johnson and Commissioner Young both. I believe that it makes it a clear regulation, and I support it. Thank you.
Okay, additional comments or questions? So there's a lot of support for moving, I think, the regulation forward. Did we want to move it forward with a universal change from big game to any game? Is there any objections to that? Are there any objections to sub D, where it says to produce images, adding real time, so that we're not looping in like a Google Earth type product? Any objections to that? Okay, seeing none, Tyler, I'll work with you to move this forward, either for approval at the next meeting, or after we talk to LCB, there might be a substantive enough change that we have to do a redraft and come back. So
Thank you, sir.
I can't say for certain what will be on next agenda in March, if it'll be for approval or for a second workshop. That's going to be partly LCB's call. So. Anything else on item 9? Okay. Hearing nothing, I will close item 9